Hi, so I am the director of the Leeds Humanities Research Institute. I also head up the cultural research team at the university. The question at the heart of this panel is how culture, and I think we could say culture and the arts and humanities, shapes our perception of health and well-being. So I think what we hope the panel will achieve is to give you a kind of snapshot of some of the different approaches and methodologies that researchers in a number of different disciplines across arts and humanities and cultural research, what they can offer in terms of understanding, communicating, imagining, and sometimes finding solutions to health issues. So because I'm really aware of time and because also I don't want to delay lunch too much, I'm not going to do long introductions to the speakers. So we're going to begin with Emma Trott, who is from the School of English.
Thanks, Alison, and I'm really pleased to be here today. And I want to discuss a long poem by James Kirkup, who you can see in that lovely painting there. He came to Leeds as the first Gregory Fellow in Poetry in 1950. And I want to focus on this poem of his, thinking about the use and what we might think of as misuse of metaphors in contemporary medicine. And this poem by Kirkup is called A Correct Compassion, and it was written after Kirkup observed open heart surgery in the Leeds General Infirmary. And I want to suggest that proposed similarities between the embodied arts of surgery and poetry might make an important contribution to an evolving healthcare discourse. Since Susan Sontag's call in the 1970s for Western culture to, and I quote, strip illness of its metaphors, the conceptual constructs that we use to articulate narratives of disease, treatment and recovery have been put under increasing scrutiny. Engineering metaphors and martial metaphors, the body has a broken part that needs fixing or a virus is invading the body, both run the risk of dehumanizing the patient or of defining the patient solely in terms of his or her disease. Recent research has demonstrated that cancer patients who approach discussions about their illness in terms of resistance, fighting, and other martial metaphors experience higher levels of anxiety and lower levels of general coping than patients who conceive of their disease in more ambivalent terms, for example, as a difficulty to be accommodated or even a companion on a journey. Further clinical research needs to be done, but perhaps it's not unreasonable to consider that raised levels of cortisol, the fight or flight hormone, over a sustained period may interact with medication and with the body's normal processes. But the focus of my talk is on the ways metaphorical constructs used in contemporary biomedicine change, and not always for the better, the ways in which healthcare functions at all levels. And I want to propose that Kirkup's articulation of the surgeon's skill as, and I quote, proper grace in forming a correct compassion, might be a valuable model of a doctor-patient relationship that has the capacity to contribute positively to the ways patients, medical practitioners, family members, and other caregivers discuss, respond to, and experience illness. Philip Allison, a cardiac surgeon at the LGI, in 1951 invited James Kirkup into his operating theatre one afternoon, and A Correct Compassion describes, with precision, detail, and empathetic respect, the mitral valve valvulotomy procedure Kirkup observed in there. And the poem's focus is on the surgeon's activity as a form of artistry, an embodied creativity supported by knowledge, technology, and skill, which can, as if it is almost natural, transform the human body. And addressing the surgeon, A Correct Compassion opens as follows. So this is how the poem opens. Cleanly, sir, you went to the core of the matter, using the purest kind of wit, a balance of belief and art. You, with a curious, nervous elegance, laid bare the root of life and put your finger on its beating heart. And the curious nervous elegance of the surgeon defines the embodied and the performative nature of this creative skill, which far exceeds learning or bookish knowledge. The mode of intelligence is one that has roots in the surgeon's own corporeality, his nerves, his muscles, and sensory receptors. So Kirkup bypasses essentialist conceptions of art and science and instead figures the surgeon as a creative practitioner whose technical understanding is no more important than intuition and empathy. And there is a clear alignment between surgery and poetry in the poem. So the fifth stanza reads, "A calligraphic master improvising, you invent the first incision, and no poet's hesitation before his snow-blank page mars your intent. The flowing stroke is drawn like an uncalculated inspiration." And the poet's admiration for the surgeon's skill is expressed in terms of a felt coherence between what are, on the surface, two very different crafts. Both surgery and poetry are conceived of as forms of embodied creativity in which the artist's body engages with the stuff of the physical world. Medicine is not preconceived, following a set of rules, but emerges in the unique interaction that takes place between the surgeon and the patient. And I now want to move the focus slightly from embodied creativity to metaphorical language and present to you a small section of what I hope will become a larger research project on metaphors in heart surgery and heart disease poetry. It is, of course, not controversial to say that metaphors are highly prevalent in almost all aspects of medical discourse. Not all metaphors have the same effect on everyone, but there is a growing body of research that has found that dead metaphors, such as the body as machine and the medicine as war that I mentioned earlier on, are, and I'm now quoting Alan Bleakley, malignant, both stigmatizing and closing off thinking within both medical and lay culture. Such metaphors produced insensibility or dulling that resists and frustrates the creation of imaginative metaphors more suited to a healthcare that refuses to objectify the patient and sees intervention in terms of collaboration rather than confrontation. So in ordinary speech and in poetry, the heart has been so much subsumed by its reference that when writers want to address the organ rather than the metaphor, they often become self-conscious in their use of the word heart. And in many cases, poets exploit the awkwardness inherent in the disjunction between a physical construct and what it means, health or illness, life or death, and a metaphorical construction and what it means, in the case of the heart, love, emotion, or pain. So, for example, Margaret Atwood opens her poem, The Woman Who Could Not Live With Her Faulty Heart, by clarifying, "I do not mean the symbol of love, a candy shape to decorate cakes with. I mean this lump of muscle that contracts like a flayed biceps." And the poet here understands the lesson from medical science that her heart is an organ made of tissues, no different from the rest of her body. But in her felt experience, she struggles to counter the feeling that the heart means more than this. In her poem, Heart Test with an Echo Chamber, Atwood writes in parenthesis, "There you have it from science that God has been whispering all along through stones, madmen, and birds' entrails. Hardness of the heart can kill you." Like most of us, Atwood inherited and absorbed the knowledge of the idiom of hard-hearted, meant as an appraisal of character, from previous generations, and now presented with, we assume, a diagnosis of a form of stenosis, which is thickening or hardening in her arteries. The poet is disturbed by her felt reaction to being told that she has, as she puts it in the other poem, a faulty heart. In experiencing the thing itself, the illness, she's nevertheless unable to shake the resonance of the metaphor. Interest in not easily reconcilable physical and cultural conceptions of the human body also inform Helen Mort's poem, Ablation. She writes, "My questions live between what doctors call the heart and what we mean by it. Wide is the gap between brain and mind." And like Atwood, Mort finds that acknowledging the felt disparity between the literal and the metaphorical is creatively productive. In the poem Stent by Maura Dooley, the poet expresses anxiety about the metaphorical consequences of her husband's heart disease. She writes, "Dearest heart, felt, rending, broken. It's what I know you by. And she's playing with the words. The organ is looming large in her image of her husband, whose illness acts on her like a defamiliarization. And as the compound adjectives are broken into two, metaphors that have been dead a long time are being revived. James Kirkup imagines his surgeon as a calligraphic master, a creative practitioner on the boundary between writing and visual art, and duly likens angioplasty to the editing of a text. Angina pectoris rustles her wings, and all the old familiar words are under attack. Let's edit. John Coulihan suggests that the physician as reader or editor metaphor is a humane one, which accounts for treatment that does not mechanize or dehumanize. And it's interesting to note that with Dooley's editing metaphor, the conceived attack alludes to a threat to language or understanding rather than body or physical health, suggesting that the martial metaphors that are so prevalent in medical discourses have been absorbed by the poet. And the sense of something coming in from the outside, an invasion, makes the couple a collective victim and formulates a narrative of disease that accounts not only for physical symptoms and treatment plans, but also for interpretations of the disease culturally founded by the patient and caregivers. In Pascal Petit's poem Lungectomy, the poet watches a surgeon perform a lung operation on someone she loves, which is both intimate and transgressive. When the chest has been opened, she writes, "That's my chance to see your heart naked," reviving the metaphor of the heart as the locus of love by recasting profound intimacy as physical and visceral. In A Correct Compassion, Kirkup is also self-conscious about the metaphors he chooses. Mid-operation, he describes the heart as love's poignant image bleeding at the dart of a more grievous passion, as a bird dreaming of flight sleeps on within its leafy cage. And in this language, so strongly reminiscent of lyric poetry, Kirkup reclaims the heart from the dead metaphor of the lover's bleeding heart, and it's paired with a second metaphor of the heart as a bird, which here amounts to the closest Kirkup comes to acknowledging the potential for catastrophe in the whole poem. The bird's dream is a reference to the soul flying to heaven after death. And in this case, each dead metaphor is revived by its proximity to the other. The bleeding heart is restored to metaphorical function, just as the bird reminds the reader that the threat is physical. And the second metaphor is restored by the reader's understanding that the bird is hovering between life and death because the anesthetized heart is sleeping. But I'm not meaning to suggest that the distinction between physical and mental lives is so easily drawn. And of course, revived metaphors often do not revert to the original meaning that they held. The language of love in these lines evokes an empathy in the reader that is extended to the patient and the surgical team. And Miroslav Holub, who was an immunologist as well as a poet, describes an imagined surgeon performing a heart transplant as, and I quote, "the masked face of a creator." Like Kirkup, Holub challenges essentialist boundaries between the practices of science and of art. The heart transplant operation is successful, and the poem ends as follows. "And when the heart begins to beat and the curves jump like synthetic sheep on the green screen, it's like a model of a battlefield where life and spirit have been fighting, and both have won." This recasting of the martial metaphor evokes collaboration rather than confrontation, as conceived of by Alan Bleakley in the quotation that I gave you earlier, and also by compassion, as suggested by Kirkup in the final lines of his poem. "For this is imagination's other place, where only necessary things are done, with the supreme and grave dexterity that ignores technique, with proper grace informing a correct compassion that performs its love and makes it live." It is perhaps not surprising that Kirkup, who was a conscientious objector and pacifist, a vegetarian, a founder member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and of Amnesty International, focuses his attention on creativity and care rather than the traditions of battling illness and defeating enemy invasions. And I want to finish by proposing compassion as conceived of by Kirkup as a metaphor with the potential to articulate the balance between empathy and objective knowledge needed by medical practitioners, and that will allow patients to formulate their own narrative constructs in relation to illness, treatment, and recovery. John Coulihan argues that emotional detachment in medical practice not only causes healthcare to suffer, but brings stress, numbness, and burnout to medical professionals. And in its presentation of new, evocative, or revived images which can inspire empathy, art can make a powerful contribution to clinical practice. At its root, the word compassion means to suffer with. And so without the problematic aspects of metaphors such as body as machine and medicine as war, a correct compassion might be a useful model for interpersonal relationships in healthcare, not only between doctor and patient, but between all actors in a healthcare narrative. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. So our next speaker is Will Rea from the School of Fine Art, History of Art and Cultural Studies.
Thank you all very much. I'm going to talk about masks in Nigeria. But I want to start with the fact that making comparisons between various countries on a global scale in terms of things like an index of happiness is actually very, very difficult, and there are very few of these surveys. But in 2011, Gallup did such a survey, and Nigeria came out at about number 11, which was considerably higher than places like the UK and America. And given the circumstances of Nigeria and the sense of its happiness index, although after last night's result I suspect not so happy, it's given us some pause for thought about what it is that actually leads to this sense of happiness. And one suggestion is it's an idea of hope. And I think the notion of hope is something that has sort of floated through some of the discussions today, but I think it's something that is worth investigating. And what I want to do is really look at a moment wherein hope might operate, and that's in a moment of abeyance, the gaps between areas, and the way in which masquerades operate within these gaps between areas. So I'm looking at different logics of medicinal thought. Some might say it's magical logics. And of course, magic and medicine have a long history of linkage within anthropology, working through explanation, prediction, and control, and those that sustain magical thought in the same way as much as scientific process. It is religion that is the outlier. And as such, magic and scientific thought both contribute to general running processes of society, in essence, production, and particularly in this instance, reproduction. So what I want to look at in terms of masquerade is a particular technology, one that we might call a technology of enchantment. In part, this came from my kind of trying to understand what these masks were. And here we have a mask that at this point is saluting a woman, but there are all sorts of various varieties of masks in the area that I work in, which is in southwestern Nigeria. And just referring back to some of the kind of youthful activities of dance and performance on an annual basis, young men will perform these masks with a great deal of physical activity, but also a sense of identity. This one is called Igigun, which is the name for masquerade. It's Igigun Rasta. And when I asked him why it was called Rasta, he said, like Bob Marley, innit? And you can see he's got the dreadlocks and the flag for Rastafari on his mask. And various other forms of youthful work get performed. It's actually some of the more senior masquerades that I'm more interested in. There are a division, and older men do perform these masquerades, and there are means and ways of understanding them. The mythical narratives, for instance, will give us some sort of insight into where masquerade comes from. And indeed, there is a deep linkage with what we might call a medical condition. That condition is leprosy. And I spent quite a lot of time working out the ways in which the leper was regarded in the community. And there is undoubtedly paradigms within West African thought which say that leprosy is a thing of the bush, it's a thing of the wild, and is caused by undomesticated forces. But it's also something that's often associated with a ruthless social exclusion. This exclusion is as much about the categorical moral standing of the person as it is about an epidemiology. Leprosy is an aspect of social life, a pointer to internal and personal morality rather than any sort of external threat. And there are a range of proverbs that work with the idea of the leper's subjectivity. It's utilized as a metaphor, as a mark of morality or immorality. Biku niara ete loa eni tiobati ete oti laboku. Social blemish is embodied in leprosy. Anyone that begets leprosy begets contempt, which expresses a sort of social loathing of this disease. And yet, the leper stands at the very heart of the masquerade process. These things which are, in turn, ancestral return from a place known in shorthand as heaven, Orum, to the world of the living, Aye. So there is a kind of structural equivalence between masquerade and leprosy. They work within borders, within liminal spaces. And within certain instances, they have the ability to induce unlimited disruption to the everyday running of society. A disruption that is magnified in the practice of these young men's masquerades. These are deeply anti-authorial. So this one is a mask known as Ajambula, and he stood up on the roof of the house opposite the king's palace as the king was making his kind of State of the Nation speech and hurled abuse at him. And of course, no one could object because he's masked, so nobody knew who he was. But it was working through the idea of the senior masquerade, a masquerade known as Ikole-Ekiti, which is the most powerful masquerade in the village, and one which is often used by people to take petitions to. And particularly women will kneel in front of the mask and it will wrap the woman in its gown. And I became kind of very interested in the kind of whole kind of symbolic narratives. There's a very, very typically kind of anthropological, there's got to be some hidden meaning, there's a secret here, there's something that I need to know. And of course, I did manage to speak to one of the performers, and I started questioning him about the various symbolic relationships and, you know, how it all fitted into a kind of great cosmological pattern and so on and so forth. And he said, well, that's rubbish. I said, well, what is it? What is masquerade? He said, Ishemi, which basically means it's my work. And so understanding masquerade as work gives a different kind of slant on the way in which these things are conceived of by people themselves. Now, there is undoubtedly a symbolic analysis to be made. White, black, and red in the costume do refer to elements of Yoruba notions of conception, in that a child is conceived through the mingling of the white fluid of the father with the red blood of the mother under the black skin of the mother. And this is a theory of conception that relates also to agricultural fertility as much as it does to human fertility. So there is undoubtedly some element of this, but there is also then that notion of leprosy reoccurring. in that a leper is often said that the leper is a child that is conceived while the mother was menstruating, in that the mingling of the fluids didn't take place in the proper order under the black skin of the mother, and that the child will be born with red blotches upon his or her skin. So there is a kind of linkage in there. But this notion and association with children gives us an indication of what the technical process of masquerade might be. And one of the things that is another marginal figure that sits throughout West Africa and is still believed in, that marginal figure is, of course, the figure of the witch. So the leper and the witch, as Mary Douglas has told us, both in 12th century Europe and in West Africa, are very often closely associated. And we, of course, know what witches do. It's inscribed in our folk tales. Witches eat children. Hansel and Gretel. Okay. So we then turn to the kind of efficacy of this magical element. What do these things do? And in part, we could take it back to this sort of Levi-Straussian notion of a psychological efficacy of magical technique. Levi-Strauss explains magic in terms of the alteration of patients' representations of their own bodies, interpreting the magical elements involved in technical working in terms of purely symbolic and representational meaning, as Levi-Strauss does, is, in my view, inadequate. Rather, I think we have an ethnographic separation, an ethnocentric separation perhaps, between our European notion of persons and things and one that exists in for this instance, West Africa. And that's produced a failure to understand an African cosmology, where the transformation of person into thing is of the utmost importance in the productive process, or things into other things. Productive processes should be continuous and uninterrupted, but it is precisely in the gaps in process, where nothing could be seen to account for what is happening, that there is the most need for magical intervention. Since it is within these gaps, between productive flow, that malevolent intention can gain its process. And I'd be very interesting to see what people's medical, a Western scientific medical explanation of those productive gaps, those interventions between flows were. Manifestation is not representation in a conventional sense as understood in Western visual culture. The manifestation of these is not a representation. These are not a visual representation of an ancestral force or an anti-witchcraft machine. At its most simple, there is no necessary symbolic gap of representation in the work of these masquerades. There is no distance between subject and concept within which the work of representation might operate. And by representation, I might suggest metaphor or symbol or allegory, referring to the previous paper. So there's no space in which that symbol can gain traction. What is made manifest here is manifested in a particular mode as a masquerade, but it is the real thing. So as a real thing, how does it work? What is its work? These are motile and immanent. They walk and wander around the town. And they achieve their action as they walk. But at its most simple and basic explanation is that they allow the production of children. The production of children is, of course, another transformation, both from fluid substance to moral human being. But also, it is the giving of breath, imi, to the inanimate body. In essence, the active life force or spirit derived from heaven. And this transformation is subject to interruption, particularly through the intervention of malevolent forces. It's in the gaps between action and result that masquerade works to have its effect. In essence, Masquerade works to facilitate a natural process of transformation from inanimate substance to living child, intervening in the process of production where necessary, whether in the form of magical intervention for particular women, or more generally in the prevention of the action of witchcraft. It's an intervention that occurs precisely while the child is in the womb, that is, at the point where the productive process is unknowable. To an extent, this might seem to be a kind of, a sort of sense of anthropological tales from far away. But there is a very distinct logic in the way in which these masquerades operate. They are a product of the 20th century. One of the problems we have in an African art history is convincing people that these things are not necessarily traditional. These were introduced into the town that I work in around about 1918. And so there is a further logic that works to their understanding. They were introduced to the town to prevent illness. That was the common explanation. They were introduced to warm children up. And there's that sense of their performance being a warming up, actually making children perform them as a way of getting them out of bed. But there's more than that. We have to take that logic seriously. And what happened, of course, in 1918 was that the influenza epidemic that was mentioned earlier hit the region that I'm working in. It's known there as Lukuluku, which is the disease that kills silently or killing by a sudden stroke. And there was an extremely high mortality rate, especially amongst children. And it's clear that these technologies of enchantment were introduced into the town at precisely that point in order to offer a way of dealing with that epidemic. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our final presentation is by Jamie Stark and Catherine Stones. Jamie is a historian of medicine and science, and Catherine is in the design school. And their project is also about communicating to children, so it'll be interesting.
Oh, it's a good fit. Okay, we get the slot, which is difficult because I'm sure you're all desperate for some food. So we'll keep this brief. So yes, I'm Catherine Stones and this is Jamie Stark, and we're here today to talk about an AHRC funded project which is looking at improving hand hygiene practice in children's school toilets. So a very glamorous subject. And we were fortunate enough to win some pump priming money. They class it as pump priming money, though it was £250,000 for a 2-year project. And school toilets are quite a sort of interesting space. We're spending a lot of time in them, unfortunately. Though, if you think about school toilets, and it's been a long time since you yourself have been in them, they are problematic spaces too. They're problematic because the facilities aren't always fabulous, they're not always full. For instance, soap dispensers, the toilets, as you can see there, are not often flushed. So they're not very desirable spaces to be in. What we also find just by scanning the literature about hand hygiene interventions in children is that most of them occur remotely. So children are taught about hand hygiene in the classroom or online in the case of the ebook website, which is heavily funded. But the actual spaces themselves where children have the opportunity to wash their hands are neglected. So they have mixed messages, sometimes just images drawn by children, no messages at all. And certainly in certain spaces, such as a toilet cubicle, and certain spaces on the wall, particularly on soap dispensers, you find nothing there. So there's no reminders. And one thing that struck us also through research are the problematic nature of the spaces and the usage on behalf of the children. So most adults, most men, do not wash their hands after going to the toilet. 34% in the UK, This is through Valerie Curtis's amazing work at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Women, 68%. But we're talking about adults there. Children, even less likely to wash their hands in and out. There's social norms at play, obviously. Their friends don't wash their hands, neither do they. So it's an interesting area to research. And our project is about making designs to sit in that space that are far more compelling, designed with the children. So again, similar to the co-design work that I just heard when I came in. The commercial sector get the cream of the creative ideas, and these don't tend to be put into the public health arena. Certainly they don't get placed in schools. So we've been looking at ambient media as a potential way of engaging the children to make these spaces more creative, more persuasive, and more engaging. There's a team of us, of course, interdisciplinary research. You need that if you're going to get the funding, to put it quite brutally, but also you need it because with a topic like this, not one of us could solve this problem on our own. So there are 3 of us working within the School of, 2 of us within the School of Design and Jamie. We've also got Colin Macduff from the ever unfortunate Glasgow School of Art. We have an advisory panel made up of a really good mix of folk, and we have a great partner in Eureka. They have a footfall of about 300,000 visitors a year. So the designs that we're making will go not only into school toilets of the partner schools, but also the Eureka Museum as well. And they're due also to have one opening up on the Wirral, which is great as well, so there'll be more footfall still. How are we doing it? We're reviewing the literature, of course. Most research begins there. So we're looking at hand hygiene practices, principles, and successful and not successful interventions. Though there aren't actually that many aimed at children that have been tested well. We've also been doing, which Jamie will talk more about, the visual review and looking at a typology of the graphic language of germs. Many of us are concerned with invisibility, aren't we? How do we make health visible? I've done quite a lot of work with visualising pain in the past. So we're often trying to find ways of making something visible so we can understand it and talk about it. And germs are, as you'll find out, a really great example of visualising something that we can't see. We've also been working with schools, obviously, and using co-design practices with school children of various ages, but primary school we've focused on. And we're also then obviously going to implement and test the designs. At this point, I'll hand over to Jamie, who'll talk more about the historical review of germs.
Thank you. So I can, it's not very often I get to do this as a historian, but I'm going to start by showing you a cartoon. This is a 1935 cartoon produced for Boots, and you won't see all of the commercial aspects of this cartoon. They come right at the end. It's about a 5 or 6 minute. I'm going to show you the first minute, which is, I think, an incredibly rich way of communicating to a public audience the way that germs might be seen to operate. You approach this rather sinister-looking castle with the skull and crossbones flying over the top. As soon as you get inside, what you see is the microbe army being drilled. So the bad health quarters is where the germs hang out. Each day, they say, the microbe army drills in ways of bringing you their ills. They'll have you with fevers, colds, and chills. Watch out or they will get you. And then we're introduced to some key protagonists. So this is the overlord of the microbe army, and he introduces us to his 3 compatriots, Captain Sorethroat, Flight Commander Fluenza, and Brigadier Blood Poison. And what you'll see there is him reaching into his inside pocket, and what he's pulling out there is essentially a plan for invasion of a home nearby to the microbe army headquarters. And through the rest of the film, they go off and they wage war against the unsuspecting John Careless and his family, who all become infected, and there's a rather riotous conflict between John Careless and his family, the good health forces of Boots the chemist, who come to their aid, and the bad health army here, who we've encountered. And of course, this is a way to both inform and entertain. There's not a sense in which Boots really thought their audiences imagined this is what germs were really doing. But the imbuing of germs with a particular kind of agency. These were organisms with a plan, and they had a clear idea about how they were going to achieve their evil ends, which was essentially wanton infection of otherwise healthy individuals. And the idea of creating different representations of germs in order to communicate public health messages was one which was an incredibly rich topic of public health policy during the middle 20th century. So this is an image from 1960 with a message which I think probably we're still all familiar with today, which is you should trap germs in a handkerchief or a tissue, essentially cover your nose when you sneeze. And you can see the germs here represented as small sort of parachute-esque figures who were being enclosed by a handkerchief, trapping them inside. Similarly, as we might imagine, germ images also tended to reflect prevailing social and political conditions. So this is an image from 1940, in the very early days of the Second World War, and there are rather obvious symbolic references to an invasion by fascist German forces. This is actually designed to promote first aid amongst people who are working in munitions and other forms of industry in order to protect the workforce. So this is acting on both the individual level, the germs invading a cut on this individual's finger, but also about ensuring the prosperity of the nation in terms of productivity. You also have here the fifth column and defeatist germs who are cooperating with the enemy in order to allow ease of access. So hints there at what a weakened immune system, for example, might do if you're attacked by germs. And finally, some of the things which come through very strongly in the images that we've looked at, and we've looked at around 200 from the British context in the 20th century, is humour. So See How They Won is a very humorous cartoon, and some of the newspaper reviews commented on how effective it was in raising awareness of the presence of germs by using humour. This is a mock-up of a public health poster produced by the Ministry of Health using a cartoon by Giles, the noted newspaper cartoonist. And what you'll see on the right-hand side here as you look at it is a workman operating a piece of machinery sneezing out into open air. And the germs don't emerge they emerge initially as a kind of amorphous cloud and then become personified as these little scurrying creatures who then take an active decision to go to the other end of the machinery and infect his co-worker. So there's a high degree to which I think germs are creatively imagined in all kinds of different ways. And although the underlying public health messages, cover your nose when you sneeze, make sure that you cover open wounds to prevent infection, have remained largely static, the visual ways in which they've been communicated have been incredibly varied. And this is just a flavour of how some of those have been reimagined. I'm now going to hand over to Catherine again, who's going to talk about how we actually use some of these historic images with the school children.
Yeah, I mean, we really have uncovered some gems of germs. You know, we're trying to catch as many as possible, rich in metaphorical language. The review, which is, as James said, has been looking at over 200 images, I think it's about 239, something like that, has resulted in a typology that we've created, which used to try and understand, I suppose, the kind of common ways in which germs have been visually represented from the scientific, which are placed within the sort of scientific world, the science lab, the world of the microscope, the carrier, which is the domestic space, the sneeze on the tube, these kinds of images that we see particularly in posters from the NHS. And also the fictional world, the analogous world. We've heard quite a bit this morning about metaphor, which is very rife. You know, there's the marshal, there's the enemy germ. The monster germ, to paraphrase Jacques Derrida, you know, to name something as a monster is to render it a pet. So by fictionalising germs in this way, does it do damage, particularly to children's understanding of germs? And there's some initial evidence to show that the way we represent germs can affect people's sense of the mobility of germs. If we picture it with legs, do people think germs move themselves, which of course they don't. So what we've been interested in is taking the historical review and using it, you know, really applying that knowledge and showing some germs taken from the typology and from the collection of germs that we've been looking at to the children and using children as evaluators. So particularly in relation to disgust, which germ would you want to wash most off your hand and why? With text, which obviously affects it, and without text, with different sorts of samples of germs. And it's a problem, to call a monster a pet and for a child to say, I want to keep that one, is a problem. So I don't think we've been critical enough in the way in which we've visualised hygiene practices and particularly germs in the past. We've also been, as part of the co-design practice, using children as informants, as experts. They know about that space. We can learn from them about their understanding of that space and their understanding about where germs are in the toilets. So we used restrained techniques like stickers and then also much more open techniques such as open drawing. Personally, I find drawing is a bit restrictive because children spend a lot of time over them choosing coloured pens, etc. And in the very last workshop, we came out of 3 workshops last week with lots of verbalisation. And that way children can learn off of each other, can grow ideas from each other in a way that they can't with drawing. So we're still very kind of open and reflective, I think, about the methods that we choose to use with children because it is quite different to co-design with adults. But we're getting some really beautiful ideas about designs for the floor. So these are designs that are not posters but will be embedded within the space and all over the space. Walls, devices, floors. But because it only started in October last year, we've still got quite a way to do. So my job over the next few months is to start designing. So thanks for your time. And we have some Twitter accounts there if you want to follow the progress of the project. And thanks very much for your attention.
So thanks for all the speakers. I think we have got some time for some quick questions, so if people could perhaps come to the front again, the speakers, and I'll take some questions. You've all kept beautifully to time, which means that we have 5 minutes for questions before lunch, which is fab. Just before I open it up, I did want to say that one of the things that's really struck me about this morning has been the focus on collaboration or participation. I mean, it's sometimes called co-design, co-production, participatory methodologies, but I think that's really come through. That's something that has crossed a lot of this, the importance of doing that, of involving kind of end users or stakeholders in the kind of research and engagement projects we're doing. So, anybody have a question for one or all of the participants? Yes, up there. Could we just wait for the mic so we can hear you? Sorry.
Thanks very much. They were really interesting presentations, and I've got a really specific and very quick question aimed at Catherine and Jamie, and it's about, you said you weren't sure about the drawing, and for me, I just wondered, in the experiences I've had, sometimes doing an activity, it may not be in the drawings that the information sits, but within the conversations that happen alongside the drawing, so you get both things. When you said you weren't sure about the drawing, was it because it was the product of the drawing that you didn't trust, or, I mean, the time it took was too, I mean, I didn't quite get that, so I just wanted...
Yeah, no, it's that one. It's a good question. We have done a lot of drawing, and we've also done a lot of eliciting, what is that, why have you drawn that? And we did that in the second set of workshops. In the last set of workshops, we were really wanting the children to generate ideas. And not much has been done in the past with communication design and co-design. Much of it with kids has been based around product design. So trying to get children to think beyond the literal, as in wash your hands, is actually really quite difficult. So what we did was we tried different techniques. So we had dummy models which the children would draw on. So there was a soap dispenser, a sink, and they would draw on those, and that was useful, interpreting them as something else. Bubblegum dispenser with bubblegum soap. So they were thinking nicely with the objects. The drawing was useful, though it didn't generate many ideas in the time that we had, because we're stealing time out of classes, so we had to work quite quickly, and that's why I found the more fruitful ideas for communicating generated through talk. Though there are some really interesting ideas drawn as well. So I'm not dismissing the drawing as a technique, but if it's time tight, I think we got equally, if not more interesting ideas when we weren't hampered by the drawing.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
Any other questions?
It's a question for Emma. And I just thought it was a really beautiful presentation, Emma, and that lovely use of poetry. And I just wondered if you've actually ever told those poems to people who are having heart surgery.
Thank you. Really interesting question. No, I haven't. I'm quite new to this particular project. I've only started it relatively recently, and so at the moment I've been familiarising myself with the conversations about metaphor in medicine, looking at what particularly contemporary poetry, because that's where my interest more generally lies, and kind of seeing what's out there in terms of heart poetry. So I haven't yet approached any healthcare practitioners or people who work in slightly different spheres, but it's definitely something that I'm interested in. And I mean, I'm aware that more and more in medical degrees, they're including the medical humanities modules and that kind of thing. So certainly talking to patients will be something I hope to look into, but also talking to educators. Thank you.
Okay, if there are no urgent questions, can we just thank the panel one more time?